In a quiet corner of the animal shelter, a heartbroken cat named Tommy wouldn't stop crying. He was mourning the loss of his owner. The family, still weighed down by their own grief, had left him at the shelter with heavy hearts. They didn't realize just how much his cries would echo through the lonely nights. One day, while checking on Tommy, the vet read the tag on his collar and suddenly froze. How had the family missed this? Welcome to Wonderbot Animals. Dr. Green slipped on his gloves and slowly walked toward the corner where Tommy was curled up. With a few treats in hand, he knelt down gently. He needed to take another look at that collar. As Tommy finally reached for a treat, Dr. Green got a clear view of the tag again. His eyes widened. "Oh my God," he muttered, quickly calling one of his assistants over. Had he read that right? The tag didn't just have the owner's name. It said something else, something surprising. Mary, one of the vet techs, rushed into the room, clearly worried. "What's going on, Dr. Green?" she asked, glancing from him to the still shaking cat in the corner. "It's just—" "Are you sure the woman who dropped him off said their last name was Carter?" he asked, looking puzzled. "Yeah," Mary nodded. "She said she was his wife. Margaret Carter, and her husband was Francis." "Why?" Dr. Green didn't answer right away. He just stared at the tag, confusion written all over his face. "If that's true," he finally said, "then why does the collar say something different? Whose name was on the tag? And more importantly, what did that mean about Tommy's real owner?" Dr. Scott Green had always loved animals. Ever since he was a kid, taking care of them came naturally. The only thing he hated was knowing they wouldn't be around as long as he would. But now, standing here, he wasn't so sure that was the worst fate. When Margaret Carter brought in her late husband's cat, Tommy, the poor animal was a mess. He'd just lost his owner a few days before, and according to the family, he hadn't stopped crying since. They had tried everything, but Tommy only ever listened to Francis. With him gone, they didn't know what else to do. "If we can, we'll come back for him," the older woman had said through tears as she handed over the carrier. It had been hard to watch, but Scott understood. She was grieving too. Taking care of Tommy would have been too much for her at that moment, or at least that's what he assumed. Scott took Tommy to an empty kennel and carefully opened the carrier. The cat stepped out slowly, pressing himself against the wall, still letting out those sad cries. It was hard to see, but Scott didn't know what else to do. He left the soft blanket inside the carrier for comfort and handed it back to Margaret before wrapping up the paperwork. He felt bad leaving Tommy like that, but he had to finish the forms to officially transfer the cat's care to the shelter. What he didn't know was just how complicated things would get. If he had, he probably would have asked Margaret a lot more questions, especially about Tommy's past. Scott had never heard a cat cry the way Tommy did. Sure, animals got sad when they lost their people, but this was different. It wasn't just grief, it was something deeper. "I'm going to check on Tommy," Scott said to Mary, his assistant, not realizing yet what strange thing was waiting for him. He found Tommy curled up in the kennel, paws pressed tightly to his face. Scott crouched down, trying to see if anything was wrong. Then he noticed the collar still around Tommy's neck. "Time to take that off," he muttered, reaching gently toward the cat. But as soon as his hand touched the collar, Tommy let out a loud screech. In a flash, he jumped back, as if jolted out of his sadness, and scurried into the corner of his cage. Hissing loudly, he curled into a tight ball, trembling. Scott froze, startled, hands still half raised. He didn't want to scare the cat more, or worse, hurt him. "Why won't you let me take off your collar?" he said softly. He had caught another glimpse of the tag during the commotion, and something about it had struck him again. Was he seeing it wrong? The name didn't match what Margaret had told him. Maybe his eyes had played a trick on him. Still, right now wasn't the time to focus on that. What mattered was whether Tommy was hurt. or just scared? Scott crept a little closer, voice low and calm. "Hey, Tommy, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you," he whispered, slowly reaching a hand toward the collar again. Tommy's eyes narrowed. With a sharp hiss, he swatted at Scott's hand, his claws just missing. Scott quickly pulled back. It was clear that force wasn't the answer. Winning this cat's trust would take time and patience. Letting out a quiet breath, Scott stood up and brushed off his pants. He needed a better approach. As he stepped away from the kennel, he kept thinking about Tommy's behavior. This wasn't just grief. He was protecting something. But what? A new idea forming in his mind, Scott walked to the storage room. Maybe a different tactic would help. Back in the kennel room, Tommy's cries filled the air, but this time they softened when Scott returned. He wasn't empty-handed. In one hand, he held a treat. In the other, a small toy. "Let's try this again, buddy," he said gently, kneeling by the kennel. He placed the treat just inside the door and slowly backed away. This wasn't about control, it was about trust. Scott sat still, watching. Tommy's eyes flicked from the treat to Scott, clearly unsure. Then, little by little, he began to creep forward. He paused, sniffed the air, then carefully stretched his neck out to grab the treat. Scott stayed quiet, a small smile on his face. This moment, simple as it was, felt like a win. As Tommy munched on the treat, Scott began speaking softly, telling him stories about the pets he'd had growing up. He hoped his voice might be a comfort, a small thread of connection. Over time, Tommy's tense posture began to ease. His body relaxed, his breathing slowed. Scott knew there was still a long road ahead. It wouldn't be easy. There would be more hard days, more confusion. But moments like this, where understanding began to replace fear, gave him hope. He'd try again, as many times as it took. This time, Scott felt even more determined. Tommy was a little more relaxed now, but still made it tough to get a proper look at the collar. It swung just out of view, with Tommy tilting his head now and then as Scott tried to shift angles. Curiosity and frustration were building. Why was this collar such a big deal? Why had Tommy reacted so strongly when Scott tried to take it off? Trying a different approach, Scott held out another treat, positioning it in a way that would make Tommy lift his head. And sure enough, as the cat reached up for it, Scott caught a clearer look at the tag. His heart skipped. "Oh my God," he whispered, the words slipping out. He wasn't just surprised, he was stunned. The name on the tag wasn't what he was expecting. Without wasting a second, he called out, "Mary, can you come here, please?" His tone was sharp enough that Mary hurried in, eyebrows raised at the urgency in his voice. "What's going on?" she asked quickly, looking between Scott and Tommy, who was calmly licking his paw. Scott was already thinking out loud, trying to piece together what he'd just seen. "Mary, do you know Margaret's full name? And we're sure their last name was Carter?" His words came fast, full of tension. Something wasn't adding up. Mary blinked, surprised by the sudden questions. "I'll need to double-check the forms." "Why? What's wrong?" Her tone shifted as she saw how focused Scott had become. "That name isn't on the tag," he said quietly, eyes still locked on the collar. There was something deeper going on, and he could feel it. Mary's brows lifted. "Not on the tag? Then whose name is?" She didn't wait for an answer. "I'll check right now," she said, spinning around and hurrying out of the room. The pieces of Tommy's past were starting to surface, and the mystery was only getting started. Scott leaned closer again, squinting at the old scratched tag. It was like trying to read something carved into an old desk at school, just faded enough to be frustrating. Tommy moved just enough to make it worse, shifting around as he sniffed the treat. Scott felt a growing sense of urgency. That tag had answers. He just couldn't read them. A few minutes later, Mary returned with that "I found something" look on her face. "Yep, they're Carters," she said, a bit out of breath. "Margaret Elizabeth Carter Mason and Francis Antonius Carter. Everything matches." Scott felt like his brain had just hit a wall. The tag he saw didn't match that at all. Something didn't make sense, like trying to force the wrong puzzle piece into place. As he looked at Tommy again, calm now, lightly pawing at the edge of the blanket, it became clear that the collar meant something special. Maybe it was more than just a name tag. It was comfort. It was home. Like a kid holding on to a favorite stuffed animal. Scott couldn't bring himself to take it off. He backed away slowly, careful not to upset the cat again, and gently shut the kennel door. Whatever was going on, he'd figure it out. Back at his desk, Scott pulled out the files and got to work. It felt like digging through an old attic, every bit of paperwork a potential clue. If this collar held a secret, he was going to find it. The answers had to be in there somewhere. The next clue in the mystery pointed straight to the Carters' home. If he wanted answers, that's where Scott had to go. Whatever was buried in Tommy's past, it was time to dig it up. Feeling like a detective from one of those crime shows, minus the theme music, Scott knew he had to do this in person. Before heading out, he caught Mary and Yara's attention. "I'm stepping out for a bit," he told them. "Call me if anything urgent comes up." They nodded without much fuss, already used to Scott's sudden missions when something didn't sit right with him. After a quick check to make sure everything was running smoothly at the clinic, he grabbed his keys and headed out. Sliding into his car, Scott typed Margaret Carter's address into the GPS. His mind kept circling back to that collar, specifically what was beneath those faded scratches. Nothing about it made sense, and that just made it harder to let go. As the engine hummed and he hit the road, Scott's thoughts spun even faster than the wheels. Why had the name on Tommy's tag been scratched out? What could be so important or secret that someone went out of their way to cover it up? He found himself drifting into wild theories, each more far-fetched than the last. What if Tommy had belonged to someone else entirely? What if there was a part of his life no one had talked about? Not even Margaret? The further he drove, the more urgent it felt. Scott's foot pressed a little harder on the gas. Tommy was probably around 10 years old, based on his health and appearance, but his clinic records didn't go back more than 6. That left 4 years completely unaccounted for. Whatever had happened during that time might be the key to understanding the cat's strange behavior and that mysterious collar. When Scott pulled up to the Carter home, the place felt almost unreal. It was huge, like something from a movie. Quiet, grand, and filled with the kind of stillness that made it feel like the house itself was keeping secrets. He parked and took a deep breath. His heart pounded, caught between nerves and curiosity. Walking up the front steps, he knocked firmly on the door, driven by the need to understand what Tommy had been through. The door creaked open, but it wasn't Margaret standing there. A younger woman greeted him instead. Scott hesitated, a little thrown off, then explained, "Hi, I'm here about Tommy, Margaret's cat. I really need to speak with her." The woman, clearly surprised, gave him a kind smile. "Oh, my mom's not home right now," she said, her tone gentle. "But I'm her daughter. Maybe I can help?" Scott wasn't sure how to respond at first. He hadn't planned for this twist, but her offer seemed genuine. Maybe this was the opening he needed. Feeling slightly awkward, he asked, "Would it be okay if I looked through some of your old family photo albums? Maybe ones from about 6 years ago? I'm trying to learn more about Tommy." It sounded like a strange request, even to him, but the woman, Jane, didn't seem fazed. "That's an unusual ask," she said with a light laugh, "but let's see what we can find." She led him inside, then excused herself to go dig up the albums. Scott was left alone in the large, elegant entry hall, taking in the space. Everything about the house spoke of old stories, layered memories, and lives lived with both joy and loss. And somewhere in there was the truth about Tommy. Scott's eyes wandered until they landed on a portrait of Francis. The man's gaze seemed to meet his, frozen in time. In that moment, it felt like even the walls of the house held unspoken stories. Surrounded by the quiet beauty of the Carter mansion, Scott felt something unexpected, a strange pull toward the past. Walking through that door had felt like stepping into another world, one where every corner whispered memories, and every photo held a secret. As he waited for Jane to return, Scott's attention stayed locked on the portrait. What would those photo albums reveal about Tommy's past? He found himself drawn to the photo again and took a few slow steps closer. It was a peaceful family moment, Margaret and Francis smiling warmly, with Tommy snuggled between them. The photo said more than words ever could. It was a simple, happy memory, but one that spoke volumes. And there it was. The collar. Scott leaned in, eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to study it. Without Tommy moving around, this still image gave him the best chance to finally read the tag. Tommy looked calm and deeply loved in the photo, relaxed in a way Scott hadn't yet seen in real life. The collar was the same one, the exact same. This time, though, no hissing or swatting would stop him from getting a good look. As he focused on the tag in the photo, he could finally make out a few of the letters. But they didn't match Francis or Margaret. They didn't even come close. Scott's heart picked up pace. Whatever this collar meant, it wasn't what he thought. The mystery was getting deeper, and the pieces weren't fitting the way they should. Still lost in thought, Scott nearly jumped when the silence was broken by the sound of Jane coming back downstairs. She was holding a thick photo album, her steps soft but steady. A mix of relief and anticipation washed over him as he turned to face her. Was the answer inside that book? Jane stopped mid-step, her eyes flicking to where Scott was still staring at the family portrait. "Why are you so interested in that picture?" she asked, curiosity in her voice. Scott hesitated. He hadn't expected that question. For a second, he thought about brushing it off with something vague. But instead, he went with what felt right, the truth. "I've just gotten really caught up in Tommy's story," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Especially how he's been since losing Francis." Jane's face softened at that. A hint of sadness passed through her eyes. Before the silence got too heavy, Scott quickly added, "I'm really sorry for your loss." She gave a small nod, maybe comforted by his sincerity. Without another word, Jane walked over and placed the photo album gently on a nearby table. Then she stepped closer to the portrait beside him. "My dad found Tommy after he was hit by a car," she said, her voice carrying a quiet memory. "He was so scared. It took forever to calm him down." Scott listened closely, drawn in by this glimpse into Tommy's early days with the Carters. The cat hadn't just been a pet. He'd been rescued, cared for, and protected. "Why didn't Francis just bring him to a vet?" Scott asked gently. Jane gave a soft laugh. "Oh, he tried?" But Tommy would panic the second he got near a car, always bolted and hid. After a while, it just felt easier to look after him at home. Scott nodded, understanding completely. For Tommy, this house had become more than a place. It was safety. But what Jane said next made Scott pause. "This all happened about 6 years ago," she said, her eyes still on the picture. "He's been with us ever since." 6 years. Scott's thoughts spun. That timeline changed everything. If Tommy had been with the Carters for 6 years, what about the other missing years in his file? What came before them? As Jane opened the album and flipped to a page with photos of Tommy, Scott's eyes locked on the familiar collar once again. This time, he was determined to figure out what it had been hiding all along. "Has Tommy always had this collar?" Scott asked, hoping it might lead to something, anything, about where it came from. Jane paused, her brow furrowed in thought. Then she nodded. "Yeah, he has." That simple confirmation hooked Scott even more. One old leather collar was now the thread tying Tommy's present to a past no one seemed to remember. Wanting to dig deeper, he asked, "Do you remember if someone else owned Tommy before your family?" Jane shook her head right away, clearly confused. "No, not that I know of." They continued flipping through the album, page by page. Each photo showed a different piece of Tommy's life, with the Carters, playing, lounging, curled up beside Frances. Sweet memories, but none answered the bigger question of where Tommy had come from before all that. Then they found it, a photo that immediately stood out. Tommy sat front and center, his collar tag completely visible, untouched by the scratches that marked it now. Scott's heart jumped. "Would it be okay if I borrowed this photo?" he asked, hope rising in his voice. "It might help me figure out how to help him." Jane hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. "Okay, just promise to bring it back." "I will," Scott said, grateful. He gently tucked the photo into a folder and thanked her before making a beeline back to his car. His thoughts were racing again, but now they were focused. The name on that tag, finally clear, was the clue he'd been missing. If he could trace it, maybe he could understand what Tommy had been holding on to, and why. Back at the clinic, Scott barely slowed down as he stepped inside, energized by what he'd found. This photo, with the collar's name fully visible, could be the breakthrough they needed. Maybe now they could finally bring Tommy some peace. The closer he got to the truth, the more determined he felt. There was something buried in Tommy's past, something that mattered, and Scott wasn't about to stop now. As soon as he walked through the doors, Mary and Yara were there waiting, curiosity written all over their faces. "What happened?" Mary asked. Without missing a beat, Scott placed the photo on the counter and pointed. "Look at this," he said, tapping the tag. "It's clear in this one." They leaned in as Scott explained everything: the visit to the Carters, the story Jane shared about Tommy's rescue, and the timeline that didn't quite add up. "See that?" he said, pointing to the tag. "It says Emily Harrington. I think she was Tommy's original owner." It made sense. Tommy's strange attachment to the collar, the way he'd protected it so fiercely. It wasn't just grief over Frances. It might have gone back even further, to when he was a younger cat with someone named Emily. Mary and Yara exchanged looks, clearly drawn into the unfolding mystery. Turning to the computer, Scott typed in the name with cautious hope. "Emily Harrington," he said aloud, his fingers moving quickly over the keys. Seconds later, a profile popped up. "Emily Harrington. Living just one town over." The address matched the timeline perfectly. For the first time in days, it felt like the pieces of Tommy's story were finally falling into place. Scott didn't wait. He found a number linked to Emily Harrington and dialed, his heart pounding in his chest. Explaining the situation wasn't easy. On the other end of the line, he could hear Emily's confusion. "I think I might have a cat here who used to belong to you," Scott said gently. There was a pause. Then Emily agreed to come by, curiosity clearly sparked by the unexpected call. As he hung up, Scott felt a storm of emotions. Was this really happening? Could this be a reunion years in the making? The clinic buzzed with quiet excitement. Mary and Yara offered encouraging smiles, sharing in the strange mix of hope and suspense. Every minute waiting for Emily's arrival felt longer than the last. When she finally walked in, Emily looked cautious and unsure, her steps slow as she entered the building. Scott quickly came over, explaining everything again in person, trying to make her feel more at ease. Together, they walked toward Tommy's kennel. Emily stayed just behind him, clearly nervous, like she didn't want to get her hopes up. Inside the kennel room, the air felt different. Tommy, who'd been yowling earlier, suddenly went quiet the moment Scott stepped in. The silence was thick with anticipation. Then Tommy saw her. He froze, his body still. Then slowly, almost carefully, he inched toward her, eyes locked on Emily. The room held its breath. Emily reached out her hand, gently, not forcing anything. Tommy sniffed, paused, and then nudged her hand with his head. A loud, familiar purr filled the room. It was all the confirmation anyone needed. Emily gasped, eyes welling up, and gently scratched his head as tears rolled down her cheeks. "I can't believe it," she whispered. Between sobs, she shared her story. How she'd lost Tommy 6 years ago during a hectic move. How she'd searched for days, weeks, and how she'd finally given up, heartbroken. Scott listened, moved by the depth of her love and the crazy way fate had brought them together again. Then Yara appeared in the doorway, shifting the moment. Dr. Scott, Margaret Carter's here. She seems upset about the photo you borrowed." The mood changed. Things got quiet again. Scott and Emily exchanged a look. They knew this part wouldn't be easy. They walked to the front where Margaret stood, clearly emotional. Her face showed a mix of grief, confusion, and concern. Emily looked unsure. Margaret looked guarded. For a second, no one spoke. Then slowly, through shared stories and overlapping memories, the tension began to fade. Emily spoke first, her voice soft. She told Margaret about losing Tommy, how much he had meant to her as a kid. Margaret, her eyes misty, nodded and shared how she and Frances had found Tommy frightened and injured, and how he'd become part of their family too. 2 women, 2 stories, 1 cat. And somehow it all connected. The conversation turned from tense to touching. They talked not just about Tommy, but about what he'd meant to them, about the comfort he'd brought during hard times, and the joy he gave without asking for anything in return. The decision wasn't easy, but one thing was clear. Both women had loved Tommy deeply. After some thought, they made a beautiful choice. Tommy would have 2 homes, shared between them, a life with both families who had cared for him in different seasons. Margaret, reflecting on everything, losing Frances and now facing this change, asked if she could still see Tommy once she had time to heal and sort things out. Her voice was soft, filled with emotion. Emily, still overwhelmed, nodded. "Of course," she said. "I'd really like that." It was a moment full of understanding, respect, and something even deeper: connection. Scott watched it all quietly, a sense of peace settling over him. He hadn't just helped a cat. He had helped mend hearts, connect lives, and guide a little soul named Tommy back to where he belonged. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more true animal stories, and share it with someone who could use a smile today.